The Shadow of the Eagle, a king forged in fire. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Dreamed of Wolves. The wind howled like 1,000 lost souls across the frozen plains of Puce, a dagger-shaped island where the mighty Danube surrendered its waters to the gray expanse of the Black Sea. It cut through layers of wool and leather, finding the skin beneath, sharp and insistent. Inside the long, low hall, thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies, the air vibrated with a different kind of intensity. Men, broad-shouldered and scarred, their faces etched by wind and war, leaned forward on rough-hewn benches. Their eyes, reflecting the flickering firelight, were fixed on the chieftain at the head of the table. Alaric, lord of the Goths, his beard frosted with age but his gaze as fierce as an eagle's, slammed a heavy fist onto the oak. The carved wolf heads adorning the table seemed to snarl in the shifting shadows. Rome. The word erupted from Alaric's lips like a curse, thick with contempt and a lifetime's bitterness. They promise foetus, treaties, protection. They speak with the forked tongue of serpents. Spittle flew. They offer grain and gold, but only if we bend our necks. Only if we surrender our sons to their legions, our gods to their Christ, our land to their greed. They call us barbarians while their own emperors wallow in decadence, poisoning each other like vipers in a gilded pit. Near the hearth, half hidden by the bulk of a seasoned warrior, a young boy listened, his breath catching in his throat. Alaric. Barely 10 winters old, but already tall for his age, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that absorbed every word, every flicker of rage and defiance on the chieftain's face. He felt the tremor in the earth beneath his feet as the warriors roared their approval, a sound like distant thunder. He saw the firelight glint on spear points and the worn hilts of spadass. He smelled the fear beneath the bravado, the fear of the endless Roman war machine, the fear of displacement, the fear of losing everything that made them Goths. Later, under a sky dusted with icy stars, Alaric lay wrapped in furs beside his father, Alaric, a lesser chieftain known more for his calm wisdom than his battle fury. "Father," Alaric whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Why does the Lord Alaric hate the Romans so? They are strong, they build great walls and roads." Alaric sighed, a long, weary sound. "Strength, son, can be a shield or a sword. The Romans wield theirs like a sword against all who are not Roman. Alaric remembers the promises broken, the lands taken, the times they turned on us even when we fought for them as federati. They see us as tools, Alaric, or obstacles, never as equals. Never as men with our own gods, our own ways." He paused, looking down at his son's intense face. "Remember this night. Remember the fire in Alaric's eyes. The Romans build walls, yes, but walls can be scaled. Roads can be marched upon. Their strength." He touched the hilt of his own dagger, is not invincible. It has cracks, and cracks can be widened. Alaric didn't sleep. He stared into the darkness, the chieftain's roar echoing in his mind, mingling with his father's quiet warning. He saw not just the fire in the hall, but the vast, terrifying, glittering image of Rome, the eternal city, the eagle standard, the legions like an endless river of iron. And within that image, he saw the cracks. A seed was planted that frozen night on the Danube's edge, not just fear or hatred of Rome, but a dawning, terrifying comprehension of its flawed power, and a spark of something else, an ambition as yet unformed, a question that would shape his destiny. What if a Goth could exploit those cracks? Chapter 2. The Taste of Ashes and Broken Promises. The years that followed Alaric's fiery pronouncement were not years of open war, but of a suffocating, treacherous peace. The Goths, the Tervingi under Alaric and the Gruthungi under other leaders, were nominally federati, allies bound by treaty to Rome. Yet the relationship festered like an old wound. Roman officials, often corrupt and arrogant, treated the Goths with contempt, manipulating grain supplies promised in the treaty, demanding ever more Gothic youths for the legions, and pushing relentlessly for conversion to Christianity. Viewing the Goths' Arian faith as heretical, Alaric grew tall and strong, learning the arts of war, mastering the spada, the long Germanic sword, the oval shield, the deadly javelin, Firmea, and the demanding skill of horsemanship that defined Gothic nobility. He listened intently to the warriors who returned from serving in Roman armies, men like his own kin. They spoke of Roman discipline, of the awe-inspiring sight of legions moving as one, of sophisticated siege engines and vast, wealthy cities that defied imagination. But they also spoke of the rot beneath the gilded surface, emperors rising and falling like leaves in a storm, generals consumed by jealousy, bureaucrats drowning in greed, and a deep-seated prejudice against the barbarian, who shed blood for the empire yet remained an outsider. Then, the world shifted. A new terror erupted from the vast, unknown steppes far to the east. The Huns. Whispers became panicked shouts. Stories spread of demonic horsemen who seemed fused to their shaggy ponies, who lived in the saddle, who fired arrows with uncanny accuracy while galloping at full speed, and who left only smoking ruins and fields of bones in their wake. They were a whirlwind of destruction, shattering the Alans and driving them west, before crashing into the Ostrogoths. The Grithungi kingdom collapsed. Panic, raw and primal, surged through the Gothic lands bordering the Danube. Faced with annihilation, tens of thousands of Goths, Tervingi, Grithungi, fragments of other tribes, and surviving Alans, fled towards the only barrier that offered a sliver of hope, the Roman frontier and the great river Danube. They massed on its northern bank in the summer of 376 AD, a desperate, starving multitude, warriors, women, children, elders, livestock, their eyes fixed on the distant Roman forts on the southern shore. Among the throng of Tervingi refugees was Alaric, now a young man in his late teens. He stood beside his father, Alaric, and another chieftain, Fritigern, who had grown increasingly critical of Athanaric's rigid refusal to deal with Rome. Athanaric himself had withdrawn into the mountains, refusing to submit. Alaric watched as envoys, including Fritigern and Alaric, rode across the swollen river to parley with Lipicinus, the Roman Count of Thrace. The promise came back. Emperor Valens, embroiled in war against Persia, offered sanctuary. The Goths would be ferried across the Danube, settled in Roman territory, Moesia and Thrace, given land to farm, and accepted as foederati, allies who would defend the frontier. Relief washed over the huddled masses like warm rain. Salvation. But the reality curdled almost instantly. The crossing, supervised by corrupt Roman officials, was a nightmare. Boats were few and overloaded. Many drowned. Those who made it were herded into squalid, makeshift camps, stripped of their weapons, a profound humiliation for Gothic warriors, by Lipicinus's men. The promised food was withheld or sold at exorbitant prices by avaricious Roman merchants. Starvation set in. Desperate Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery for scraps of dog meat. Alaric saw proud warriors reduced to begging, saw children wither away, saw the light of hope die in his father's eyes. The Roman promise was ashes in their mouths. Lipicinus, fearing rebellion but also seeing profit, invited Fritigern and Alaric to a feast in the nearby city of Marcianople. It was a trap. During the meal, Roman soldiers attempted to assassinate the Gothic leaders. Alaric was cut down. Fritigern, fighting like a cornered wolf, managed to escape amidst the chaos, racing back to the Gothic camps. The taste of betrayal was now laced with the metallic tang of his father's blood. Alaric, upon hearing the news, felt something harden within him, a cold fury replacing the youthful uncertainty. The cracks in Rome weren't just visible, they were gaping chasms of treachery. The spark ignited by Athanaric's words years before flared into a consuming flame of righteous anger. The Gothic War had begun. Chapter 3. The Rising Storm, Adrianople and its Echoes. The murder of Alaric and the attempt on Fritigern was the spark that ignited the tinderbox. Furious Goths, already starving and humiliated, erupted. They broke out of their squalid camps, swarming the countryside. Roman garrisons were overwhelmed. Farms were plundered not just for food, but in a desperate, enraged bid for survival and retribution. Lipicinus scrambled a force to confront them near Marcianople, but the Goths, fighting with the desperate fury of men with nothing left to lose, shattered the Roman lines. Lipicinus fled in disgrace. Alaric fought in those chaotic early battles. He saw the terror in Roman eyes as the Goths, unleashed and vengeful, swept aside disciplined formations. He learned the brutal calculus of survival warfare, the swift raid, the ambush in wooded hills, the reliance on mobility that Roman infantry struggled to counter. He saw villages burn, Roman and Thracian alike, caught in the storm of Gothic fury and Roman mismanagement. The lessons were harsh. Roman strength was brittle when faced with determined, mobile foes fighting for their lives. Roman leadership was often incompetent and venal. Emperor Valens, finally recognizing the scale of the disaster unfolding in his own backyard, abandoned his Persian campaign and marched west in 378 AD. He gathered a formidable army, confident in the invincibility of the Roman legion. Fritigern, leading the now united Gothic host, Tervingi, Grithungi, and Alan allies, sought to avoid a pitched battle, knowing Roman discipline usually prevailed in open-field engagements. He maneuvered, sent envoys offering peace in exchange for land, and tried to wear down the Romans in the harsh Thracian summer. Valens, pressured by arrogant advisors and perhaps underestimating the Goths after earlier skirmishes, refused. On August 9, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, modern Edirne, Turkey, Valens forced a battle. The day was scorching hot. Roman troops, weary from marching and deployed hastily as Gothic cavalry unexpectedly returned from foraging, faced a Gothic army drawn up in a massive wagon laager, a mobile fortress. Alaric, now a young leader commanding a band of warriors, likely fought on the flanks. He witnessed the pivotal moment. The devastating charge of the Gothic and Alan heavy cavalry returned just in time, led by chieftains like Alathius and Saphrax, smashing into the exposed left flank of the Roman infantry. It was carnage. The Roman lines crumpled like rotten wood. Trapped and slaughtered within their own formations, two-thirds of Valens's army, including the emperor himself, whose body was never found, perished. The Battle of Adrianople sent shockwaves through the Roman world. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae, 6 centuries earlier. The myth of legionary invincibility was shattered. For Alaric, Adrianople was a revelation. He saw the eagle fall. He saw the corpse of an emperor lost. He saw disciplined Roman infantry butchered by the very barbarians they despised. The cracks weren't just exploitable, they could bring the whole edifice crashing down. The Gothic host, though victorious, remained a massive, hungry refugee army trapped within Roman territory. The new Eastern emperor, Theodosius I, a formidable general and statesman, adopted a strategy of containment, diplomacy, and attrition. He resettled some Goths as foederati in the Balkans, granting them land in exchange for military service. Alaric, his name now gaining prominence among the younger Gothic warriors, likely entered Roman service during this period. He learned Roman tactics, command structures, and politics from the inside. He saw Theodosius's strength, but also the deep divisions between East and West, the simmering resentment towards Gothic foederati, and the fragility of imperial unity. He absorbed it all, a keen observer, waiting, honing his skills, and nurturing the ambition kindled on the banks of the Danube. Chapter 4. The Wolf in the Fold, Service and Betrayal. The years following Adrianople were a tense, complex dance between the Goths settled within the empire and their Roman overlords. Alaric rose steadily within the ranks of the Gothic foederati, serving the Eastern Empire under Theodosius I. He wasn't just a fierce warrior. He demonstrated leadership, strategic acumen, and an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman politics. He commanded Gothic auxiliaries, leading them in Theodosius's campaigns against usurpers like Magnus Maximus in the west. He saw the empire from the privileged, yet precarious, position of a valued but distrusted ally. He marched with Roman legions, slept in Roman camps, dined with Roman officers. He learned Latin fluently, understood Roman law and administration, admired their engineering, and grasped the sheer scale and complexity of the imperial machinery. But he also saw the deep-seated prejudice. He felt the condescension, the whispered insults, barbarous, the constant suspicion that Goths were inherently disloyal. He witnessed the corruption, the factional infighting that paralyzed the imperial court even as external threats mounted. Most crucially, he understood the profound and growing rift between the two halves of the empire, the Greek-speaking East under Theodosius in Constantinople and the Latin-speaking West, increasingly centered in Milan, ruled by the young, weak Emperor Valentinian II and dominated by his powerful Magister Militum, master of soldiers, the half-Vandal general Flavius Stilicho. Alaric served loyally, or so it seemed. He fought for Theodosius at the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394 AD against the western usurper Eugenius. The battle was brutal, a bloodbath where Theodosius, relying heavily on his Gothic foederati used as shock troops, achieved victory at a horrific cost. Gothic casualties were appallingly high. Alaric himself likely fought in the thick of it, witnessing the cynical sacrifice of Gothic lives in a Roman civil war. The rumor spread, perhaps true, perhaps Gothic propaganda born of bitterness, that Theodosius had deliberately placed the Goths in the front lines to weaken them. The victory secured Theodosius as the sole emperor of a briefly reunited empire, but for the Goths, it tasted of betrayal. Their blood had bought Roman unity, and their reward was suspicion. Then, in January 395 AD, Theodosius the Great died in Milan. The empire was formally divided between his two young, incapable sons, Arcadius, 18, in the east, dominated by the scheming Praetorian prefect Rufinus, and Honorius, 10, in the west, under the regency of Stilicho, who claimed Theodosius had named him guardian of both sons. The fragile unity shattered instantly. The Gothic foederati in the Balkans, grieving their losses at Frigidus and feeling leaderless and cheated, found their natural commander in Alaric. He was Roman-trained, a proven leader, respected by his people, and deeply embittered by the perceived betrayals and the sacrificial use of Goths at Frigidus. In the power vacuum following Theodosius's death, Alaric saw his moment. He wasn't just seeking revenge or plunder anymore. He was pursuing a king's ransom, legitimacy and security for his people within the Roman system. He demanded what he believed the Goths were owed: recognition, proper provisions, high military command, and land for his people. He didn't initially seek to destroy Rome. He sought to force it to honor its commitments to the Goths, to treat them as partners, not disposable tools. He was proclaimed King Rex by his warriors, not of a distant Gothic homeland, but of the Goths within the Roman world, a king whose crown depended on Roman recognition. When Rufinus in Constantinople, fearing Stilicho's ambition more than Alaric's Goths, refused Alaric's demands and likely withheld pay and supplies, Alaric acted. He led his people, warriors, families, wagons, out of their settlements. It wasn't a mindless rampage, it was a calculated demonstration of power, a move to pressure Constantinople. They swept through the undefended provinces of Thrace and Macedonia, plundering to sustain themselves, a mobile nation on the march. Alaric the Roman officer had become Alaric the Gothic king, a wolf who had learned the ways of the fold only to turn on the shepherds when the promises proved empty. The dance was over. The hunt had begun. Chapter 5. The Dance of Eagles and Wolves, Alaric versus Stilicho. The years following Alaric's elevation as king became a high-stakes chess game played across the mountains and valleys of Greece and Illyricum, with the Gothic host as the formidable, mobile piece Alaric wielded with increasing skill. His opponent was Flavius Stilicho, the de facto ruler of the Western Roman Empire. Stilicho, half-vandal, supremely confident, and a brilliant general, saw Alaric as both a threat and a potential tool. He aimed to contain the Goth, use him against the Eastern court in Constantinople, which Stilicho distrusted profoundly, and ultimately bring him to heel for the West. Alaric's initial thrust south into Greece in 395 to 397 AD was devastatingly effective. Bypassing well-defended cities like Thessalonica, his forces poured into Attica. The famed walls of Athens closed against him, but legend, and some historians like Zosimus, suggest the city fathers, perhaps recalling ancient prophecies, were simply pragmatic, negotiated, and paid a hefty ransom to avoid destruction. Corinth fell. The Peloponnese was ravaged. Sparta, symbol of ancient martial glory, was sacked. Alaric stood at the isthmus, poised to unleash his host on the rich cities of the peninsula. The east was paralyzed by the rivalry between Rufinus, soon assassinated, and his successor, the eunuch Eutropius. Stilicho, ostensibly coming to the aid of the east, but primarily to assert Western influence, finally arrived by sea. He landed at Corinth, marched to the isthmus, and managed to outmaneuver Alaric, trapping a significant portion of the Gothic force. It was a moment of potential victory. But then, mysteriously, Stilicho pulled back. Ancient sources, often hostile to Stilicho, claim Eutropius in Constantinople bribed or negotiated with him, fearing Stilicho's power in Greece more than Alaric's depredations. Stilicho withdrew his fleet, leaving Alaric largely intact, though temporarily checked. Alaric escaped the trap, retreating north into Epirus. The East, desperate for peace, appointed Alaric Magister Militum per Illyricum, master of soldiers for Illyricum, in 397 AD. It was a stunning reversal. The Gothic king, who had just ravaged Greece, was now a high-ranking Roman general, tasked with defending a Roman province. Alaric had forced recognition. He had his Roman command, his legitimacy, and access to Roman arms factories in Illyricum to re-equip his army. Stilicho, outmaneuvered politically, seethed. The peace was fragile. Alaric used his position in Illyricum to consolidate his power, rebuild his forces, and watch the imperial courts tear each other apart. In the east, Eutropius fell from power and was executed. In the west, Stilicho faced rebellions in Africa and unrest in Italy. Alaric bided his time, waiting for the next opportunity to leverage his strength for his people's permanent security. By 401 AD, tensions boiled over again. Alaric, perhaps dissatisfied with supplies, perhaps sensing Western weakness, marched west, not as a raider, but as a Roman general demanding satisfaction. He crossed the Julian Alps and invaded Italy itself. Panic seized Rome. For the first time in centuries, a foreign enemy threatened the Italian heartland. Stilicho, recalled from dealing with other threats, acted swiftly. He stripped the Rhine frontier of troops, a decision with future catastrophic consequences, and rushed to defend Italy. What followed were 2 years of dramatic maneuvering and 2 pivotal battles. Pollentia, Easter Sunday, 402 AD. Stilicho caught Alaric by surprise near the town of Pollentia. The battle was fierce and inconclusive, fought on a holy day, causing outrage. Alaric's wife, according to some sources, was captured, along with much of the Gothic baggage train. Alaric himself fought his way out, his host bloodied but unbowed. Verona, summer 403 AD. Stilicho pursued Alaric northwards and engaged him again near Verona. This time, Stilicho achieved a clearer victory, inflicting heavier losses. Alaric was forced to retreat back across the Alps into Illyricum. Stilicho had saved Italy, temporarily. He was hailed as the savior of Rome. Alaric had been defeated tactically, but not destroyed. More importantly, he had achieved a psychological victory. He had brought terror to the gates of Rome itself. He had proven that Italy was vulnerable. And he had forced Stilicho, the mighty regent, to negotiate. Another treaty was struck. Alaric withdrew, his forces intact, his status as a power broker confirmed. Stilicho, needing Gothic manpower for his own ambitious plans, potentially against the east or to secure the Rhine, agreed to pay Alaric a substantial subsidy for 1,000 pounds of gold, according to some sources. Alaric the Wolf had been driven back, but he remained a potent force, licking his wounds and watching, always watching, for the next opening in the empire's crumbling walls. The dance continued, but the rhythm was shifting. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. Honorius, Stilicho, and the web unravels. The years after Verona were a deceptive calm. Alaric retreated to the Balkans, consolidating his power base in the buffer zone of Illyricum, a province nominally under Western control but effectively contested between East and West. He watched, with the patience of a predator, as the Roman Empire tore itself apart from within. The focus of his ambition remained fixed, securing a permanent, prosperous homeland for his Goths within the imperial structure, with himself as their recognized king and a Roman magister militum. His primary adversary, Stilicho, was increasingly embattled. The Vandal general's power in the west rested on his control of the child emperor Honorius, now in his late teens, but still dominated by his regent, and his formidable military prowess. But Stilicho faced enemies on all fronts. The Eastern court, Constantinople, deeply suspicious of Stilicho's ambitions, especially after his interventions in Greece and Illyricum. They saw him as a usurper of Eastern prerogatives. Roman aristocrats. Many traditionalist senators resented Stilicho's barbarian heritage and his monopoly on power. They whispered against him, painting him as a traitor in league with other barbarians like Alaric. Military threats. Constantinus III, a usurper in Britain and Gaul, drew Stilicho's attention and resources northwards. More ominously, the stripping of Rhine garrisons for the Italian campaigns of 401 to 403 had left the frontier dangerously weak. Alaric, waiting in the wings, demanding the subsidy promised after Verona, and pressing for formal recognition and land. Stilicho needed Alaric's Gothic warriors as potential allies against the East or the usurpers, but paying and placating him fueled resentment in Italy and Constantinople. Alaric played this complex game masterfully. He maintained communication with Stilicho, reminding him of his obligations, the subsidy, and his potential usefulness. Simultaneously, he subtly probed the Eastern court, offering his services against Stilicho if they met his demands. He was a free agent, leveraging the mutual hostility between East and West for Gothic benefit. His demands crystallized. He wanted a formal treaty, foedus, recognition as king of the Goths, the prestigious Roman rank of Magister Militum for the Western Army, not just Illyricum, and, crucially, land in the fertile Danube region, Pannonia, for his people to settle. Stilicho, juggling crises, seemed to acquiesce. In 407 AD, facing the usurper Constantine III in Gaul and needing to counter Eastern influence, Stilicho pushed the Roman Senate in Rome, a largely ceremonial body but still symbolically important, to approve a massive payment to Alaric, a staggering 4,000 pounds of gold. The senators, horrified at paying protection to the very Goth who had invaded Italy, protested bitterly. One senator famously quipped, "Non estis pax, sed pactio servitudis," this is not peace, but a covenant of servitude. Stilicho browbeat them into agreement, arguing it was necessary to buy Alaric's alliance against the East. The gold was sent. But Stilicho's position was crumbling. The payment inflamed anti-barbarian sentiment in Italy. Rumors swirled that Stilicho planned to place his own son on the Eastern throne, using Alaric's Goths. The Eastern Emperor Arcadius died in 408 AD, succeeded by the 7-year-old Theodosius II. Stilicho saw an opportunity to go east and assert his regency claim. He ordered Alaric to hold himself ready to move against the Eastern court, promising to fulfill all Gothic demands once Constantinople was under control. Then, disaster struck. Radagaisus, a formidable Ostrogothic king, led a massive invasion force, allegedly over 100,000 warriors and families, across the Alps into Italy in late 405/early 406. Stilicho, with remarkable speed and skill, rallied forces, including Hunnic and Alan auxiliaries, and crushed Radagaisus near Florence in 406 AD, capturing and executing the Ostrogoth king. While a tactical masterpiece, it further drained Western resources and distracted Stilicho from Alaric and the Rhine. Immediately after Radagaisus's defeat, on December 31st, 406 AD, the frozen Rhine frontier collapsed. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, fleeing the Huns, crossed the river near Mainz in overwhelming numbers. Gaul was overrun. Britain revolted, declaring Constantine III emperor. Stilicho was overwhelmed. His plan to march east with Alaric evaporated. Alaric, camped in Naricum, roughly modern Austria, watched the Western Empire implode. He had received his gold, but not the promised land, rank, or treaty. Stilicho, his patron and sometimes adversary, was besieged by enemies in Ravenna, where the imperial court had moved for security. The anti-barbarian faction, led by the ambitious Olympus, convinced the weak-willed Honorius that Stilicho was a traitor plotting with Alaric to seize power. In August 408 AD, Honorius ordered Stilicho's arrest. The great general, abandoned by his troops, sought sanctuary in a church but was dragged out and executed. His son was murdered. A vicious purge of Stilicho's family, friends, and barbarian troops throughout Italy followed. Thousands of Gothic families in Roman service were massacred. News of Stilicho's fall and the massacres reached Alaric in Naricum. Any lingering hope of negotiation with the Stilicho faction died. The massacres were a direct attack on his people, a betrayal of the federati relationship. The time for subtle diplomacy and leveraging Roman factions was over. The wolf, patient for so long, bared its fangs. The gold was meaningless without security. Honorius, freed from Stilicho's control but now dominated by the anti-Gothic Olympus, refused all of Alaric's demands. The path was clear. Alaric gathered his host, swollen by Goths fleeing the massacres in Italy. He pointed his army south, towards the Italian plains. His goal was no longer just a treaty or land. It was to march on Rome itself and force the empire, by terror if necessary, to give his people the home they desperately needed. The storm broke. Chapter 7. The Eternal City Trembles, the First Siege. The autumn of 408 AD saw a sight unimaginable for centuries, a barbarian army, disciplined and purposeful, marching unopposed down the Via Flaminia towards the very heart of the Roman world. Alaric's host crossed the Alps not as invaders sneaking through passes, but as an avenging force moving with grim determination. The Gothic king, clad not in Roman uniform but in the armor and furs of his people, rode at their head. The fire of betrayal burned in his eyes, betrayal of promises, betrayal of treaties, betrayal culminating in the massacre of Gothic families. This march was different from the incursion of 401. It was born of righteous fury and a desperate need to secure survival. Northern Italy offered little resistance. Cities closed their gates, but Alaric, focused on his ultimate prize, bypassed them. His goal was not random plunder, it was leverage. He moved swiftly, efficiently, cutting supply lines to Rome. By late 408 AD, the Goths stood before the Aurelian walls, the massive fortifications encircling Rome. The city that had ruled the known world for centuries now found itself under siege by the very people it had once deemed savages. Inside Rome, panic was absolute. The Eternal City, its population swollen to nearly 1 million, relied entirely on grain shipments from Africa and Sicily. Alaric controlled the roads and the Tiber River. Hunger began to bite almost immediately. The specters of disease and starvation, horrors Rome had inflicted on others but not faced itself for so long, stalked the streets. The Senate, desperate, sent envoys to Alaric's camp. The Gothic king received them with cold courtesy. His demands were stark: all the gold and silver in the city, all movable wealth, and the liberation of all barbarian slaves. The envoys, aghast, asked what he would leave them. Alaric's reply echoed through history: your lives. Negotiations began, fraught with desperation on one side and steely resolve on the other. Alaric moderated his demands, but the core remained: payment and recognition. He knew Rome's psychological and symbolic value was immense. Sacking it was not his immediate aim. It was his ultimate threat. The Senate scraped together a ransom: 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 hides of scarlet-dyed leather, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. A vast fortune, stripping the city bare. They also agreed to send envoys to Honorius, holed up in the impregnable marsh fortress of Ravenna, pleading with him to negotiate with Alaric and grant the Goths land. The ransom was paid. Alaric lifted the siege in early 409 AD and withdrew his forces north to Etruria. Rome breathed a sigh of relief, but it was temporary. The envoys to Honorius, influenced by Olympus, returned with a flat refusal and insults directed at Alaric. The emperor, safe behind Ravenna's lagoons and walls, dismissed the Gothic king as a mere brigand. Alaric's fury was volcanic. He had taken the ransom, but Honorius's rejection made a mockery of it. The Goths were still landless, still outsiders. He marched south again, reimposing the siege on Rome in late 409 AD, tighter and more ruthless this time. This siege was different. Alaric wasn't just blockading. He was tightening the noose, capturing the port of Ostia, Rome's lifeline to the sea. Starvation became acute. Despair turned to horror as stories of cannibalism began to circulate. Disease ran rampant. The Senate, utterly broken, realized Honorius would not save them. They had to deal with Alaric directly. In a move of breathtaking audacity, they deposed the absent Honorius, in name only, and declared a new emperor, Priscus Attalus, the prefect of Rome, a compliant aristocrat chosen by Alaric as a puppet. Alaric was appointed Magister Militum by his own emperor. Alaric now had a Roman emperor in his pocket. He marched Attalus towards Ravenna, hoping to force Honorius into negotiation or flight. He sent a Gothic force under his brother-in-law, Athalf, to secure grain-rich North Africa, Rome's breadbasket. But Attalus proved incompetent and arrogant, refusing to listen to Alaric's counsel. The mission to Africa failed disastrously. Honorius, receiving unexpected reinforcements from the east, grew bolder. Attalus became a liability. Alaric, realizing the puppet emperor strategy was failing, publicly stripped Attalus of his imperial insignia near Rimini in 410 AD and sent him into exile. He had gambled and lost. The only card left was terror. He turned his host, weary but hardened, back towards Rome for the third and final time. The Eternal City's fate hung in the balance. Alaric's patience was exhausted. The wolf was at the gate, and this time he intended to enter. Chapter 8. The unthinkable, the gates swing open. The late summer of 410 AD settled over Rome like a shroud. For the third time in 2 years, Alaric's Gothic host encircled the city. The mood, however, had shifted profoundly. The previous sieges had been exercises in pressure, negotiations conducted under the shadow of starvation. This time, Alaric radiated a chilling finality. The ransom was paid, the puppet emperor had failed, Honorius remained obstinately safe and dismissive in Ravenna. Diplomacy had exhausted itself. Alaric's Goths, though weary from years of campaigning, were fiercely loyal and hardened by betrayal. They knew this siege had only one possible conclusion if Rome did not capitulate utterly. Inside the walls, despair had curdled into a numb, fatalistic dread. The granaries were empty. The stench of death and disease hung thick in the air. The Senate was paralyzed. The people, once proud citizens of the Caput Mundi, head of the world, huddled in their homes or crowded into churches, praying to gods old and new for deliverance that seemed increasingly impossible. The myth of Rome's eternal inviolability was cracking under the weight of relentless reality. Alaric issued no grand ultimatum this time. He simply tightened the blockade, sealing every gate, watching the life slowly ebb from the city. He knew Ravenna wouldn't act. He knew Rome couldn't hold out much longer. His scouts reported no relief force. The time had come. How exactly the Salarian Gate opened on the night of August 24th, 410 AD, remains shrouded in legend and conflicting accounts. Some chroniclers, like Procopius, writing later, claim it was divine intervention or simple negligence. Others suggest a coordinated attack overwhelmed the defenders. The most persistent rumor, recorded by historians like Jordan's, is that sympathetic slaves inside the city, possibly Gothic slaves freed in the first siege, or simply desperate Romans, opened the gates secretly. Alaric, it was said, had promised freedom and reward. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was cataclysmic. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon on August 24th, the massive Salarian Gate swung open. A roar erupted from the Gothic ranks that shook the very foundations of the city. Alaric's warriors, disciplined but fueled by years of pent-up rage, frustration, and the primal urge for survival and retribution, poured into Rome. The sack of Rome had begun. Alaric had given strict orders. Churches, particularly the great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, were to be respected as places of sanctuary. The Goths, largely Arian Christians, shared a reverence for Christian holy sites. Violence against those who sought refuge there was forbidden. Similarly, Alaric reportedly placed guards at the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. But beyond these islands of enforced sanctity, the city was given over to plunder. For 3 days, Rome endured a controlled nightmare. Gothic warriors, joined by escaped slaves and desperate Romans, ransacked palaces, senatorial villas, and wealthy homes. Gold, silver, jewels, silks, artworks, and sacred objects were seized. The famed treasures of generations of Roman conquest were loaded onto Gothic wagons. There was violence, inevitable in such chaos. Some resisted and were cut down. Women were assaulted. Buildings were set ablaze, either accidentally or deliberately. The Forum, the heart of Roman power, echoed with Gothic shouts and the clash of looting. The Capitoline Hill, symbol of Jupiter's might, was not spared. Yet, crucially, it was not the wholesale massacre and destruction later sacks would inflict. Alaric maintained control. He wanted wealth to sustain his people and, more importantly, hostages and symbolic power to force Honorius's hand. He seized Galla Placidia, Honorius's formidable half-sister, as a valuable prisoner. He took senators and aristocrats captive. The physical damage, while shocking, was localized. The Pantheon, the baths, the great aqueducts remained largely intact. The population, while terrorized and stripped of wealth, was not subjected to systematic genocide. Alaric was sacking Rome, not annihilating it. He was sending the most brutal message possible to Ravenna. This is the price of your intransigence. Recognize us, or this is just the beginning. On the third day, laden with unimaginable plunder and driving thousands of captives before them, the Goths withdrew from Rome. They marched south, aiming for the grain-rich lands of southern Italy and the ports, perhaps contemplating an invasion of Sicily and then Africa, Rome's vital breadbasket. Alaric had achieved the unthinkable. He had humbled the eternal city. The news reverberated across the empire and the known world like a seismic shock. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Augustine, in North Africa, began writing The City of God, grappling theologically with the fall of earthly Rome. The psychological impact was immeasurable. The myth of Rome's eternity died on August 24th, 410 AD. Alaric had not just opened the gates. He had shattered an illusion that had sustained the Mediterranean world for centuries. Chapter 9. The Unfinished Odyssey, South to the Silent Shore. The Gothic host, burdened with the plunder of ages and trailing a long column of Roman captives, including the imperial princess Galla Placidia, moved south from the smoldering ruins of Rome's pride. The air crackled with a strange mix of triumph and uncertainty. They had defied the eagle and lived. They had taken the greatest city on earth. Yet, they were still a nation in exile, an army without a home. Alaric's gaze now turned towards the fertile fields of southern Italy, and beyond them, the glittering blue promise of the Mediterranean. His goal was clear: Africa. The province of Africa Proconsularis, modern Tunisia, was the granary of the Western Empire. Control Africa, and you controlled Rome's food supply. You possessed the ultimate leverage against Honorius, still cowering behind the marshes of Ravenna. More than leverage, it offered the prospect of a permanent, prosperous homeland for the Goths, rich agricultural land, defensible ports, and independence from the crumbling Italian peninsula. With Africa secured, Alaric could dictate terms to Honorius from a position of unassailable strength. The march south was a demonstration of Gothic power and Roman impotence. Campanian towns either surrendered or were swiftly overwhelmed. Capua, Nola, and other centers saw Gothic foragers, but Alaric pressed on towards the Strait of Messina, the narrow channel separating Italy from Sicily. Sicily, fertile and strategically vital, would be the stepping stone to Africa. Alaric reached the Calabrian coast near the town of Rhegium, modern Reggio Calabria, in late 410 AD. Across the strait, barely 3 miles away, lay Sicily. His engineers began assembling a fleet. Makeshift rafts and boats were cobbled together from timber commandeered along the coast. The Goths, primarily horsemen and infantry, were not natural sailors, but the crossing seemed feasible. Africa was tantalizingly close. Then, disaster struck. As the first wave of Gothic troops attempted the crossing, a violent storm erupted in the strait. The flimsy vessels, overloaded and manned by inexperienced sailors, were no match for the sudden tempest. Ships foundered. Men and horses were tossed into the churning waves and drowned. The wreckage washed up on the Calabrian shore, a grim testament to the sea's power. The storm was interpreted by many, Goths and Romans alike, as a sign of divine displeasure. Neptune, or the Christian god, seemed to be defending Africa. Alaric watched the destruction from the shore, his face like stone. The loss of life was grievous. The failure of the crossing was a devastating strategic blow. Africa, the dream of security and abundance, had been snatched away by the caprice of the weather. The momentum of the sack of Rome stalled on the rocky shores of Calabria. Frustration and doubt began to seep into the Gothic ranks. Where could they go now? Back north, towards a vengeful, though still weak, Honorius? Back into the Balkans, where Eastern Roman forces waited. Alaric, ever resilient, refused to yield to despair. He withdrew his forces from the coast, marching northwards again into Bruttium, modern Calabria. They needed supplies, rest, and a new plan. Winter was approaching. Perhaps they could regroup, build sturdier ships in the spring, or find another way. He sent envoys yet again to Honorius in Ravenna, perhaps offering Galla Placidia as part of a deal, reiterating the desperate need for land for his people. The demands were likely more modest now, perhaps just settlement in Noricum or Venetia. But Honorius, perhaps emboldened by the failed crossing, perhaps still under the influence of anti-Gothic advisors, remained intransigent. No land, no recognition, only defiance. The strain of relentless campaigning, the weight of leadership, the crushing disappointment of the failed African venture, and the constant struggle to feed and secure his people began to take their toll on Alaric. As the Goths camped near the town of Consentia, modern Cosenza, in the autumn of 410 AD, a sudden fever seized the king. It raged quickly, defying the efforts of his physicians. The man who had shaken the world, who had stared down emperors and stormed the eternal city, was laid low not by a sword, but by sickness. Within days, Alaric I, king of the Visigoths, was dead. He was probably around 40 years old. His life's work, finding a secure homeland for his people within the Roman Empire, remained unfinished. He died not in glorious battle, but in a dusty camp in southern Italy, the shores of Africa still visible only in the mind's eye, the gates of Rome behind him, and the future of his nation shrouded in uncertainty. The architect of Rome's greatest humiliation passed from the stage, leaving his grieving people and a stunned world to grapple with the consequences of his extraordinary, tumultuous life. Chapter 10. Legacy in Motion, the Birth of a Kingdom. The death of Alaric near Consentia cast a pall of deep uncertainty and fear over the Gothic host. They had lost not just a king, but their visionary leader, the architect of their survival and their defiance. The plunder of Rome was meaningless without the man who had won it and promised to transform it into a homeland. The question hung heavy in the Calabrian air. What now? Alaric's body was treated with profound reverence, befitting a king who had led them through fire and triumph. According to Gothic tradition and later legend, vividly recounted by Jordans, his followers sought to honor him in a way that reflected his stature and protected his remains from desecration by vengeful Romans. They diverted the course of the small river Bucentis, modern Bucento, near Consentia. In the dry riverbed, they dug a deep tomb. Alaric was laid to rest with a portion of the immense treasure plundered from Rome, a king's ransom to accompany him into the afterlife. The river was then returned to its natural course, its waters swirling eternally over the grave, concealing it forever. The slaves who performed the labor were allegedly killed to protect the secret. Alaric, the restless king, found his final, hidden resting place beneath the waters of a conquered land. Leadership passed to Alaric's brother-in-law, Athalf. A capable warrior and leader in his own right, Athalf faced an immediate crisis, holding the Gothic nation together and finding a path forward without Alaric's strategic genius and unifying presence. The dream of Africa was dead. Southern Italy offered no sustainable future. Honorius and Ravenna remained implacably hostile. Athalf, perhaps recognizing the futility of endless confrontation with Rome and influenced by the formidable Galla Placidia, Honorius's half-sister, whom Alaric had captured and Athalf would later marry, adopted a different strategy. He led the Goths out of Italy in 412 AD, marching north into Gaul. Gaul was in chaos, ravaged by Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and the usurper Constantine III. Athalf saw an opportunity not to destroy Roman power, but to restore it, under Gothic influence. He envisioned the Goths becoming the protectors of the empire, the necessary barbarian strength propping up Roman civilization. He fought against other barbarian groups in Gaul and Spain, styling himself as a Roman general restoring order. In 414 AD, in a lavish Roman ceremony in Narbonne, he married Galla Placidia, a symbolic union of Gothic might and Roman imperial bloodline. He reportedly declared that his initial ambition to replace Romania with Gothia had faded. Instead, he sought Gothic strength to restore the Roman name. It was a vision Alaric might have understood, though pursued through different means, integration rather than confrontation. However, Athalf's vision was short-lived. Constantius III, Honorius's new powerful general, blockaded Gothic ports in Gaul, forcing them into Spain. In 415 AD, Athalf was assassinated in Barcelona by a rival Gothic faction. The Goths, leaderless and desperate, briefly returned Galla Placidia to Honorius in exchange for grain. But their need for land was more desperate than ever. Under their new king, Wallia, the Goths struck a fateful bargain with Rome in 418 AD. Emperor Honorius, needing a powerful force to crush the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi rampaging in Spain, granted the Goths land in the province of Aquitania Secunda, in southwestern Gaul, centered around Toulouse. They were to be federati once more, defending the empire against its enemies in Spain. This was the seed Alaric had planted through fire, blood, and relentless pressure. The Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, later expanding into Spain, was born not as a conquest from outside, but as a recognized entity within the crumbling Roman West. Alaric had never settled his people. He had died a king without a kingdom. But his relentless campaigns, his sack of Rome, his unwavering demand for a homeland within the imperial system, had forced Rome to finally yield. The Goths gained their fertile land, their autonomy, and eventually, their own kingdom. Alaric's legacy was paradoxical. He was the scourge of Rome, the man who breached the unbreachable, shattering an ancient illusion and accelerating the empire's decline in the West. Yet, he was also the founder of a nation. His life was a testament to the indomitable will of a people seeking survival and dignity. He exposed the fatal cracks in the Roman edifice, proving that barbarians were not merely a nuisance, but a force that could shape the destiny of empires. He died a barbarian king, but his actions paved the way for the Visigothic kingdom, a hybrid Romano-Germanic state that would endure for centuries, a direct result of the relentless pressure applied by the boy who once dreamt of wolves on the frozen banks of the Danube. His shadow stretched far beyond the hidden tomb in the Bucento, shaping the map of Europe and heralding the end of the ancient world and the painful, tumultuous birth of the medieval.